for, I think, the second B3 translation topics at 12. Today we're going to be presenting on, sorry, there's just a little audio dissonance here. So today we're going to talk about research and translational research ethics. Just going to go through an overview here. We're going to just do a quick plug, again, for the Research Ethics Consultation Service. Getting into what we do, I mean, we could just do the plug right now. Please come and see us. Again, at any stage of research, as we had talked about before, it seems a relevant kind of, at any point it seems relevant. Is that still?
Yes. And you don't necessarily, you don't have to go through the form on the CTSI website. I mean, if you want to just contact myself or Erich directly via email or phone, or just come and see us, you know, that's totally appropriate as well. Right. Even if you don't think it's a research ethics consult, but you have a question or you know, something that you've been struggling with, come and see us. We like to talk about this stuff. Mm-hmm.
And we like to actually get engaged in things that we have no idea about. So on the front end, I like throwing myself in the deep end a lot. So, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some ethical decision-making frameworks and then various frameworks in research ethics. We'll go back to revisit the three-dimensional matrix on research ethics based on sort of ethical dimensions of systems research. And then we'll get into a case study in applying matrix to some facial genetics research. But we'll also, you know, but before then, if you have any questions or have any cases or examples you'd like us to go through or think through, we'd like to open that up as well. So we do have this case here that we're going to go through. We have the PI on the case here with us, and so we could go through that. But again, we want to make space and make some time for any of the kind of questions you might want to ask. Okay.
Great. Yeah. So, like Erich said, we're going to talk. I mean, the point of this is to really work through some exercises and think about how ethical decision-making is done. And it's not that we expect you to walk away knowing exactly how to do this, but it gives you a sense of, if you would come to either Erich or myself or a consult, you know, these are some of the tools that we might use, and they may be useful to you in trying to help think whether there is an issue or not. So research ethics decisions are made in using different tools. Some of the tools in research ethics we've taken from other domains, for example, moral philosophy and clinical ethics. And the next two slides are just some examples, and I'm not going to go into those in great detail, any detail at all, really. They're just kind of examples to show you that, to demonstrate that the framework that we're going to go into detail about is not alone. You know, it's there are a number of different tools that can be used, and we just today would like to practice on the three-dimensional matrix approach. So some of the practical approaches that are used a lot in clinical ethics are principalism. Probably are familiar with that. That is based on beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and fairness. There's the 4-box method that is used a lot in clinical ethics, and that's basically, you know, there's a matrix. It's put into 4 boxes, and to think through the ethical issue or question that has come up, you look at medical indications, you look at patient preferences, you look at quality of life, and you look at contextual features. And the authors of the 4-box method, you know, have some questions, and it is actually a tool that is used and can be very helpful. There are theories that are used or turned to a lot in ethical decision making in clinical ethics, and some extent in research ethics, we may kind of unconsciously rely on them. There's non-consequentialism, which is really thinking about duties, utilitarianism, consequentialism, casualty, looking back at prior cases to think about how to address any particular issues coming up in the current case, and then virtue ethics, which really looks at motives and thinks about, thinking about having the right desire or motivation in terms of the action that you take. And then in so in research ethics, again, principalism is often used. In fact, for those of you who use human participants in research, you'll probably recognize that the Belmont Report and the regulations that we rely on for oversight of humans in research really rely heavily on principalism. There's S7O, so far no objections, that was developed by Jim Dubois. And it's really kind of takes looking at common denominator approach and really asks people to look at who the stakeholders are, what the facts of the case are, what the ethical norms, legal norms at question or at stake or related to the case may be. And then it's at the end, you kind of take all those facts, working through them, and then think about different options or reflections to take. There's also a 6 domains approach that was developed by Ken Pimple, and it's really pretty broad, and it asks investigators to ask 3 different questions about their research, and then is it true, thinking about scientific integrity, is it fair, collegiality, protection of participants, animal welfare, institutional integrity, is it wise, social responsibility. So, and then there's also, of course, the core competencies, conducting clinical translational research, and we have a handout for those. Now, all of these are just examples, and it's not that one is better than the other. In fact, sometimes I think, you may use a mix or match of some of them, and you probably, if you really think about it, they're all kind of intertwined and are comprised of different components of each other. And so we also have
I just want to say something real quick about the core competencies, that this really came out of the CTSA ethics key function area before those were dismantled. But it really focuses on regulatory knowledge, research ethics, and research integrity issues. And it looks really at the core competencies for really any kind of person engaging in clinical and translational research. So I want to make sure that this is something that gets handed out and looked over, because I think it's a really good checklist approach to thinking about, what are your duties and responsibilities as a CTSI researcher. And I think this came from Nick Stenick, and also James Dubois and Elizabeth Heitman, and Alexander Kahn. So I think that was a really nice summary from all of the knowledge that had been coming out of the ethics KFA that could really be, used and applied across the CTSAs.
It also, I think, it's very similar. Many people who are plugged into this have probably taken some form of responsible conduct and research, which is a course that is really kind of largely the purpose of that is to introduce investigators to some of the overall high-level aspects of these core competencies.
Agreed. So I'm gonna take over for a little bit here and discuss the 3-dimensional matrix again. This is something that we saw at the last presentation, but I'm going to go through really what the 3 levels are, because in part, and Jen, I'm not sure if you'd agree with this or not, but it's really hard, I think, to teach or to expect people to understand the philosophy and the ethical philosophy and moral philosophy as well that underpins all of these things. So in a sense, I'm trying to develop, or what I'd like to do are develop tools which don't require particularly an understanding of all of, the deontology, virtue ethics, and a lot of these other issues, and mainly, in a sense, trying to translate those things into more of a kind of common practice and a common checklist for practitioners as well.
I completely agree. And I think, to be quite frank, and you would probably concur with this as well, when we sit down with investigators to think about research problems and solutions, we don't ourselves go and say, oh, well, we're going to use utilitarianism to do this. We think about practical approaches to enabling and facilitating translational science to go forward in a responsible way. So exactly.
Right. So yeah, so in a sense, that's for those ideas, those theories are for us to manage and hopefully translate into more practical means for identifying those areas and those topics as well. So again, they're divided into what we would call, and what I showed you, are the kind of core competencies, or really what it means to be have professional and research integrity. Both based on RCR training and getting into a broader set of but regulatory kind of conditions and knowledges as well. And so broader and social and environmental impacts, again, that comes out of more of what the NSF and certainly now the NIH and such have done, looking at, what are the broader reasonings for the research, and what are the broader considerations that affect, I would say, beyond the sort of scope or beyond the confinement of the research project itself. So how does the research project extend into society? And then embedded ethics and methods and analysis, which really get into much more the standards of practice within a particular kind of scientific endeavor or research endeavor, and particularly in terms of analysis and deriving hypotheses and handling of uncertainty and things like this. So let's just go through them again. Professional and research integrity. We want to certainly focus on professional integrity, of course, honesty, accountability, risk awareness, and then research integrity, the classic falsification, fabrication, plagiarism. And I've also added in there kind of its own category because it has its own series of problems and conditions, which is really considering data integrity. And then subjects and stakeholders, I think that's the typical kind of how do we handle how informed consent, how do we handle the recruitment of subjects, and then how do we, as the SFNO kind of approach, how do we really begin to consider stakeholders and the consideration of stakeholders that are directly involved, not secondary stakeholders, but primary stakeholders that are directly involved in the research itself. And then credit and acknowledgement, of course, what does it mean to do proper citations, proper responsible authorship, and those kind of things that are typical to providing continuity throughout the fields. And then conflicts of interest, these can certainly be from the institutional level all the way down to the individual within a lab, and thinking about, how do we avoid, bias, basically sneaking into or not being made transparent in terms of the researcher themselves and then the interest they might have. Obviously a very interesting topic these days on other accounts. Broader social and environmental impacts. I think, again, how do we think about advancing, of course, discovery? I think we're all very wired towards that in terms of how we argue for the importance of our research. But thinking about also how this extends into teaching and learning and training based on, that research. How are you including graduate students? What are you doing, for example, to create, a network for broader engagement? Broader participation of underrepresented groups. So we're talking about You know, are we leaving people out of a study? Are we undersampling a particular study that's causing bias? Are we not taking into account, say, you know, disabilities or people with disabilities or geographic remoteness, ethnicity, economics, all of these kind of things? Again, infrastructure for research and education, networks, partnerships, things that we're, you know, all really trained to consider now based on a lot of grants.gov funding. Dissemination and translation of results, and then what are sort of the broader benefits to society. Dissemination and translation of results, I think, is a particularly tricky issue because you never know exactly how your data or your findings might be taken up, or if they're going to be, you know, you can never write something that can't be, you know, quoted and used out of context. It would be impossible. So, but really thinking about how you're going to disseminate those results and translate them to various modes of expertise is, I think, a real important issue. And that gets a lot into the public communication and public understanding of science issues, and how, you know, Jen and I were talking yesterday a lot about how we can better train and think about training scientists in terms of their, you know, responsibility as sort of, you know, basically civilians, or what we kind of refer to as civic science. And then benefits to society writ large, you know, thinking about, well, how could this work go out there and actually help people? And then, of course, public policy, what are the implications in terms of regulatory implications for this work? What are the application implications? Are there elements that can be enabled that help tech transfer and knowledge transfer, particularly to underrepresented communities, particularly, say, in, you know, what we call like developing nation communities and things along this line? What kind of research needs to be made, you know, done for decision-making purposes? So really trying to understand what decision makers might need and what kind of research would best serve some of those needs. And then I'm not going to go through too many of these, but social justice, right, distributive, procedural, intergenerational justice issues. What are the implications and transformations to economy and society? Are you going to change somebody's capacity to, say, work in a particular field by, like I used the example last time, say, like an insulin pump? You know, managing certain disease and things like this enables certain economic transformations. And then, of course, risk and precaution, something that we really need to take into account, I think, in terms of the broader considerations, not just in terms of how we account for risk, in terms of risk to the subject population, but risk, broader risk to society. And then, sorry. And then embedded ethics, again, getting into framework and global assumptions that really are sometimes encased in the language of the field, or framework, the choice of framework conditions, what we consider to be the representational limits of our paradigm, how we choose values for certain variables and how we justify the choice of those variables. Again, language and terminology use. And then one of the things I think is particularly interesting, and I think we'll see this in today's case even too, is what are the justifications for representativeness of the data to the phenomenon one is trying to say exists in that sense. So how far do we need to go in that sense, or have we acknowledged how far we can go and how far we yet need to go? So that basically, when is enough data? When do we know we have enough data? Selection and weighing of cognitive values. Have we oversimplified, over-reduced the problem? We have to obviously reduce, in a lot of ways, be reductive, particularly when we're modeling and doing complex modeling. Otherwise, we can't even always collect the data of those systems. Scope, again, what is the sort of range of the analysis? Is there an internal consistency? Are we running into problems, perhaps even with the scale of certain data sets as compared to others? Consistency with other beliefs within the field, and again, kind of getting to justifications for representativeness. What would we consider to be empirical adequacy? Again, how do we know we've made enough observations? Standards of proof, this is, I think, gets a lot into statistical significance, and how do we recognize and handle type 1 and type 2 errors in the handling of the null hypothesis. Classifications, what are we, what are the ontologies that we're using? How do we know when a set is closed, or what how those sets, data sets, or the bins that we might be using are bounded and not spilling over, say via outliers or handling of unclassified data points. And then choice of research question hypothesis, choice of methods, causal explanations. All of these really sort of get into the fundamental motivations for the research itself. What are the broader field interests that are directing us? Of course, you can't really apply for research if the funding agency interests aren't aligned with that research, or they're not part of that call. So of course, that's always shaping the kind of research we have to choose to do. Certainly it has to be in the interest of the funding agencies themselves. And then explanations of meaning and narratives, the classic correlation versus causation, simplifications and reductions for model usability, and then how we select causal factors and such. Are we ready to, well, actually, should we open it up and see if anybody has questions or would like to think about a particular case that we can analyze?
Yeah, I think we should do that. Or even, a case or a question that you might have about something specific to your research that you're doing.
And the folks online can either jump in and unmute yourselves, or you can type in a question too.
Well, if we can come back to that if people have, once we go through the example here.
Before you go through the example, let me bring you a question that came up in my course this morning.
Oh, great.
Because Patricia Gordon and Kathy Hay were teaching, and the question came up that had to do with ethics and autonomy of using social media information. Say we have a rheumatologist in the group, and he said, well, what if I was interested in going online and looking at all of the blogs that deal with people who have juvenile rheumatoid arthritis and talking about the different kinds of self-care that they have arrived at. And I developed a hypothesis that those people who were taking over-the-counter medication X were doing better than the other people. And so I'm going to look at 500 of these already published comments and collapse them and learn what I can from it. The question is to us in the IRB world is he required to do anything more than to inform the IRB that he's doing this when he creates the research plan and put in a protocol and hoping that they will provide a determination that it's exempt. And so then I would ask you guys, is there an ethical issue there in using that information that has been provided by 500 different individuals autonomously?
I I'll jump in on this,
Okay.
and then Eric can jump in as well. But I think I've kind of talked to some other colleagues at my former institution about this, who did this type of work. And I think it's an interesting question. And technically, if you're following the regulations, his work is exempt because he's not using human subject data. But I think in the context of being socially responsible, there's no way that he can actually inform those individuals. But one way to kind of get a sense of what that stakeholder group might think would be to do some focus groups with individuals who have that condition and see what their thoughts are in the context of the use of that data in that way. I think the investigator also has a real obligation to ensure that he does absolutely nothing to go back and try to identify the individuals. Clearly, when they are blogging and posting online, they're posting it out for everyone to see. However, they've not consented for research.
Right.
And I think some individuals see a big difference in the context, well, I'm not okay with anyone using those data for research or using me. They see those data as a part of them for research, and I'm not comfortable with that. So that puts more of a note, since the investigator can't identify them, I think it puts some of the onus, somewhat of a burden of it, not in a negative way, on the investigator and his institution to be what I would call good stewards of those data. They're going to be housing those data. They may be using them in other ways. And so I think there's ethical issues. I think the other thing is just kind of coming back and asking, is it a reasonable research question? It seems like it is a reasonable research question, what he's doing. But those are some of my thoughts on it.
I have some. Well,
Go ahead, Eric.
Well, so first of all, I mean, exemption doesn't mean you don't get informed consent. I think basically an exemption, it just sort of means that you can use things like test results and things like this, like literally student tests if you're doing something like class and educational things where, you know, but you can't identify those things. I think in this case, you would actually need to get informed consent. And then
Eric, hold on. That's impossible.
You can't do that.
No. But let me say this. Hold on. Let me just say this. I know it's impossible, but you can't really use those data to publish in a sense.
Yes, Eric, I kind of respectfully disagree with you on that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, we could talk about it further. But researchers use all the time published data out there.
No, I understand that. But what I'm saying is it depends really on the kind of things you're trying to do from this. I mean, it's a self-selected population, first of all, right? I'm not saying that it's you're breaking privacy or you're doing things, but I mean, I don't know.
You can go to the newspaper and you can count the number of words. This is publicly available information. You're trying to tie people's hands one more time, and it's just not. No.
I guess that what I'm not understanding then is really what you're doing with the data in that regard.
You're counting things.
I mean, what are you counting in that sense? Like, to me, if you're trying to produce something that needs to be like therapeutic, I mean, I guess what I'm not understanding here is exactly what is. So the
investigator has a hypothesis that
right.
those people with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis who take ibuprofen, let's say,
Okay.
see their provider fewer times per year than those who do not. And he can get that kind of data by looking at these 500 blogs of 500 individuals. That's what the idea.
Okay, well, I in that case, though, I just wouldn't trust the data. I mean, unless that was.
That's a different issue altogether.
Yeah.
Well, that's a different issue. The issue is, is it okay to use the data? And I think it's reasonable to use the data.
Yeah.
I mean, there is.
But just not
Well, you'd have to assume that everybody is actually talking about whether or not they're using that particular drug.
Hold on, Eric. Larry's.
I was just going to say that one of the things you mentioned when you were discussing the ethics was you have to make an assessment about how valid is the research in determining whether it's ethical or not. So, in other words, isn't the ethicist in part having to make a value judgment as part of this?
Yeah, that's a good point. But I think
So let's walk this back. So Dr. Christensen, he's got this idea, he's got a protocol, and it's got to go through the institutional IRB, and he's hoping it's going to come out exempt. Before it goes to the institutional IRB, in our institution, it has to go through a scientific review committee. And at that point, somebody is going to say, well, I think this plan is hogwash. Or someone's going to say, that's an interesting idea. It's going to be a self-selected population. You won't know very much about it, but it could lead to the kind of pilot data that would lead to hypothesis testing. So I think that's the valid way that this kind of thing is going to go forward. And we're going, I'm sure we're going to see it with social media ballooning.
we do see it, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, the ethicist does look at the scientific value, but you also are kind of looking at potential. I mean, our goal is to really look at what are the potential harms. And, you know, I think just at the very practical level, I mean, that's what I like to think of myself as someone who works to find practical recommendations to enable the science to get done.
Yeah, so I guess the thing would be,
Right.
what you're saying is that the ethicist, if there's scientific assessment of validity, you'll accept that and then take that and then try and determine the practical solutions.
For the most part, I would not. I'm not someone.
Blanket statement.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that blanket like, but
I wouldn't trust it for making therapeutic claims. That's all I'm saying.
but I
because
don't think that's the goal. I mean, I think
if we're trying to develop hypotheses and initial cases, yeah, no, I understand. I'm just saying that, like, if we're trying to do therapies out of this or kind of come to therapeutic conclusions, then about whether or not they should take this particular drug, I wouldn't trust it.
We're not doing that, Eric.
yeah. I think you're very right. There's a lot more and more of the big data that we're going to be seeing that our institutions are going to be housing and have responsibility are going to be from these blogs and Twitter feeds. And I mean, all these people like Vasant are developing these natural language logarithm things to go in and search and pull stuff out. So it really expands, I think, the scope of responsibility that not just investigators have, but I would argue, institutions, in thinking about themselves as good stewards of data and developing governance structures that are not just about data standards, but also the different stakeholders involved. And
Yeah,
again, bringing that back to a practical point, I mean, the practicality of that is institutions like us, to do what we do, we rely on public funding. And if we don't have the trust of the public, if we're not being trustworthy, then we're, to be quite frank and to kind of crass, we're screwed. So,
well, and I would also ask, what is the feedback to that particular community as well? What are the plans for that? And how is that information going to be used or even put back on, say, that, that blog or something like that? So what is the responsibility of the person, using it? I mean, believe me, the last thing I want to do is put more hurdles in the way, right? I mean, and I know it
sounds terrifying.
No, it's not about that. It's just, I'm just saying, we got to be cautious about the kinds of conclusions we're drawing from these open data sources, because, look, I mean, how do we verify it, right? I mean, how do we verify the accuracy of the claims unless we have those individuals in front of us or whatnot? I mean, people can write anything on a blog, so that's why I just.
People can say anything when you interview them. I mean, why is this any different from any other data collection? When you have a bunch of patients, they're all volunteers.
Well, there's a difference between autonomy online and I think being, aware and informed how that data and how that survey might be used. That's all.
And social desirability questions, because people routinely lie when they're providing data. That's
Yeah.
what humans, they exaggerate, they don't remember, they have self-perception biases. This is a huge area of research in its own right.
Mhm.
So, I worry that this special opportunity that we see of scraping data and finding out things that we can't find out now, all of a sudden is going to be subject to another governance structure because,
No, it's more about the claims. I think one can base on those, right? I mean,
that's a scientific question, it's not an ethical question. And it
Well,
goes
but
through-
they're-
these are papers that are published that go through a scientific review committee with experts in the field. And to be an outsider from the field and to be able and to be making judgments about the quality of the data and whether or not the claims are valid, I think oversteps the ethicist role.
Can I ask
I
you-
think it's a
Let's
purpose to provide
questions.
reflexivity and ask those questions, not to be a hurdle.
I was just curious with the modeling. Is it that there's an ethical issue about what you use to simplify and reduce? Or is it that you have to, in detail, describe what you did? In other words, every model has different degrees of simplification.
Right. I think it's avoiding overconfidence in our projections that we draw from those conclusions in that sense.
So if you state in there, in your discussion, that this model is based on these assumptions,
Right.
limitations are based on this, then that's okay. You can still publish it. And I'm not asking this because I'm doing modeling, but
Yeah.
it just always struck me that every time you see one of those papers, there's a challenge because it's always, you can always adjust the model to end up with
What you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a problem with statistics. And I think that's why increasingly there's a merging of appropriate use of biostatistics with doing ethical research, responsible research, integrity of the research. It's not something that I personally could look at and judge on, but as someone who does research ethics, I would, I see my role as saying, wow, that looks pretty complicated. Have you consulted with the biostats person? When did you do that with a biostats person? I think, the misuse and abuse of biostats and modeling is probably one of the reasons. Sometimes I don't think it's necessarily intentional. I think it's because people are just think they know what they're doing and they don't know what they're doing. And it's one of the big issues that's led to the lack of reproducibility that the biomedical sciences are trying to deal with, especially in the genomics world, in clinical trials too.
I was just thinking of that because there are all these online tools now where if you have a data set, you can just go plug it into these online tools.
Yeah.
But if you don't know what the different choices are
Yeah.
that you're making, how can you be sure that you're actually getting valid, accurate results?
Yeah, I mean,
it's a big issue.
Biostats, if you're doing a study like that, should be one of the first things you think about in terms of study design. And so that's not, I think, some of the things that Erich has on his embedded ethics and method and analysis sheet, it's not something that necessarily the research ethicist in a consult would deal with, but it's more this broader issue of saying, investigators, you to kind of think about integrity of your work and being professional and responsible should think about some of these things in the design and analysis of your work. I don't know if that helps or not.
So let's move on to the case here. And principal factors affecting global variation in the human face. So we have Dr. Mark Shriver here, who is the PI on this, so he can weigh in anytime and certainly we can ask him questions directly as well. Human facial variation is substantial and is affected by both genetic and non-genetic factors. Facial variation is associated with overtly craniofacial disease and more subtly with many other disorders. We propose to investigate how typical range facial variation is affected by primary non-genetic factors, that is sex, age, height, weight, and genomic ancestry, and by individual genes. So the aims of this study, model the facial effects of major non-genetic factors in multiple population samples, discover alleles affecting typical range facial variation within and between populations. In 3, perform functional studies of the alleles mapping to typical range facial variation. And then the subpoints, computational approaches to identify putative, causative, regulatory variants falling within, is it GWAS or GWAS? GWAS significant SNP blocks. Epigenomic mapping of regulatory elements in CNCCs from the Batwa pygmy and Bachiga populations. And then aim 3C, experimental strategy to assay the impacts of facial variation on associated genetic variants on enhancer activity. And then the research would like to take future directions, again, towards perhaps more the translational and therapeutic side of things. These analyses will establish a foundation on which many future research projects will build. The typical range effects for genes involved in craniofacial disease immediately suggest hypotheses about the facial variation expected for these conditions. Are there similarities between the typical range facial effects and clinical range facial effects? Future work will be focused on working with medical geneticists to test these hypotheses. Once 3D face scans and DNA from persons with craniofacial disease are available, clinical range effects can be compared to the typical range effects discovered in this work. So that was a quick overview. And what I'd like to do is just, you know.
Can I add one more piece to this that I don't think
Absolutely.
made it? I think what's interesting is Dr. Shriver is going to, for participants to participate in this study, the GWA is going to be done, it's going to be done in collaboration with a company. So just to kind of put that out there, I think when you're thinking about the first set of questions that we'll ask that maybe should be considered in the context of, you know, these data, you know, Mark will be getting those data, but in a sense, you know, a company, a for-profit entity.
Actually, that's no longer the case, Jen.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, they're moving away from that. Any 23andMe and any.
And so when we are still using 23andMe for some of our studies, but they don't have access to any of our raw data. We're using their genotyping services for researchers. So, you know, they have a platform that allows you to recruit participants. The participant gets the account and the kit, and you get authorization to get the raw genotype data. But we've never given 23andMe any phenotype data. We haven't collaborated with them on any studies like that.
Yeah, I understand that, but I think it still raises some interesting issues that I don't think are necessarily problematic, but in the context, in the perception of some individuals who are consenting to this, it could be problematic just because of this perception of ownership and who has access to the data, even though they don't technically have legal access to it. It's just based on some of the experiences I've had. I think it's something that investigators have to be attuned to, that some people are sensitive to this idea of companies having data, genomic data, GWA data. So I agree it's not an issue, but it is in the sense that some people are sensitive to it.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely routes to commercialization of some of the tools that we develop and that others can develop from our data. And one of the new things for me in this proposal is collecting the data for genotyping at Johns Hopkins CIDR They have the Center for Inherited Disease Research, which is a core lab for NIH, basically. So, but it also requires that those are then very open to data sharing. So they, in fact, go directly into dbGaP, the database for genotype and phenotype research, which was developed to help prevent studies being done again and again, and not any standardized way to accumulate the data for further research. So these will be the first data that I'm collecting for that kind of repository. It is a monitored repository where people have to demonstrate that they're authentic researchers and have appropriate oversights, but companies can request that data. So really the data becomes very much open to any kind of research, within the bounds of the consent that the participants gave. So that getting the right kind of consent for the uses and making sure that that is flows through is something that's new to me. I've always just done research where I use the data primarily and will collaborate with people who have the skills that I need to complement the research, but not, where I'm actually handing data over to the government in this case.
So Erich, flip to the next slide. Yeah, so I think the issue that you're raising really fits right under this idea of participants and stakeholders and thinking about, you just outlined some of the issues that need to be considered in your process of developing the consent document, but I think also the consent conversation that you have with individuals. And it's being very clear that the data will not be within Penn State. They're not going to be within the laboratory of Dr. Mark Shriver. They're going to be shared broadly, and being very transparent about that. And again, I just speak to this based on my experience working with biobankers and other people who do NIH-funded genomic research, in which a minority, but I think it's a minority of individuals that we need to be respectful of, have real significant issues if any type of their data are going beyond the walls of the institution or the investigator that they have. People also have real concerns. Anytime you throw the word government into something, that can get some people pretty worked up too. So I think the fact that you are acknowledging these issues and recognizing these, it's almost like Erich gave you the matrix ahead of time, because you're thinking proactively about some of the particular issues in the context of participants and stakeholders, and being respectful to them.
Well, yeah, we have been funded by the National Institute of Justice and also the Department of Defense. And, we always disclose who is sponsoring the research. Our current funding is from Procter & Gamble company. But the DOD and NIJ, those have, I'm sure caused potential participants to not want to participate. And I recall, a few conversations, not really that many, people who were concerned about, defense research, and also others concerned about forensic research and the police, aspect, interacting with police. Likewise, potential colleagues also have concerns about those sources of fundings and about, the general potential for use of these kinds of data by, entities that they see as threatening to different communities. So, those have come up as issues over the past, it's really almost been 20 years I've been collecting participants for this kind of normal variation research.
Yeah, that's all I was going to say, is that this is something too that's I think evolved over quite a long period of time, and the institution and the IRB have pushed back and required more. So to think that Mark was in this place maybe 15 years ago in terms of the informed consent process, I think it looks very different now than it probably did 15 years ago. in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, the whole. I think more changes are coming, and I want to be prepared for those. Additionally, I'd like to consider making an open database where people, something like the Personal Genome Project or the Open Humans research efforts, because I think these data and having, really calling, giving companies out there who are making tests and selling them to police right now, and they haven't been validated. They're not publishing their results, so it's not really science that they're basing their predictions on, their facial predictions, but they're doing this. So if we had a resource that we could say at least, type these 100 people, give us your predictions, and we'll tell you how good they are, as an independent set of data that could be assessed. I think that would be really useful, and I'm sure there are participants who would be fine with that sort of use as well, provided we can really describe it for them, the potential risks.
And I guess I go back. I mean, I see the kind of one of the main points of you requesting the consult. A concern that you have is how to create a very appropriately transparent and responsible consent process. And I think it's, if you want, planning to have an open database, I think the goal, what your responsibility is as an investigator, which is kind of challenging to meet, I think, not that it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, is just ensuring that everyone who consents fully appreciates what it means to have data broadly shared, what it means if they agree to be on an open database website, and what that means and who would have access to it. And I think it's an issue that we in genomic and big data are going to continually struggle with, because how can you be certain that anyone who enrolls in a study really fully appreciates when they're allowing their data to be shared broadly for unspecified future use, that they kind of have an appreciation that means almost anything. And then that kind of goes back to my statement that when we were having the conversation about the use of the blog data, I think it puts an onus not only on the investigator, but on the institutions themselves to be aware of that valuable information that they're housing. And I mean, there's no way, we have to be honest that there's no way we can 100% prevent any type of breaches of confidentiality or privacy or misuse. But we, I think, have an obligation to do what we can to put things in place to ensure that that doesn't happen. So I think that it's, I think it's great that you're very aware of these issues and thinking proactively about them.
Erich.
Yeah. Yeah, 2 minutes. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, just briefly, maybe I have an interesting perspective here. I just participated in Mark's study about 3 weeks ago, absolutely. But what I wanted to say is I was extremely impressed with the consent process. I've been a research coordinator for years, and it seemed to me as you and your staff were going to fairly great lengths, not only to be transparent about the connections to P&G, about what data might be used for, what it might be used for, if in fact there was some sort of de-identification, which of course we can't guarantee 100% about. So I just wanted to say that there is an evolution in consent, clearly more so in the last couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years, distinctly. And I think you and your staff were doing a great job at talking about this with each one of the participants.
Oh, thanks. Appreciate it.
Well,
this is your next meeting, right?
There they are.
They're already coming into our the CTSI meeting here. So we should quickly wrap up. I just wanted to say that there's plenty more here to think about. I would, there are issues, not issues, but just there are some black box things here in terms of the statistical analysis, mainly due to patents on some of these processes. And so there's some questions I think that would be really good based on the embedded ethics side of things, but we just don't have time to get into right now. And thank you for the questions, everybody, and the comments. And thank you to Mark Shriver here for joining us today. And thank you, Jen, and Dee, and everybody else, and Sarah over there. So I hope this was of value, and we look forward to the next B3 series next month.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
For sure, yeah.